I'd just like to start by saying that I'm connecting with you all from the land of the Darug people, uh, which is now known as the northern suburbs, northwest suburbs of Sydney. And I think this is really important because to acknowledge this, and because when talking about border violence, we're really talking about the ways that border violence and the imaginary in Australia around the border and people seeking asylum in particular is deeply connected with Australia's colonial history and the ongoing colonial legacy. And particularly the displacement, discrimination, and dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here in Australia. So we'll talk a little bit about the colonial connections here. And I just think it's also a very important time to discuss this issue because Australia's border regime, a particular kind of border regime, is influencing other countries around the world, in particular the UK and certain European countries. And I think it's just horrifying that the colonial outpost, what was once a penal colony that has expanded and morphed and become enhanced itself, replicated itself in different ways to create new prisons, new forms of incarceration, is now impacting and teaching the colonial metropole, the center of empire. So I think these are the sorts of themes that we'll talk about as we discuss the issue of border violence in Australia, focusing on the detention center in Nauru. I'm going to share my screen because we've developed a PowerPoint presentation to facilitate today's discussion. So the images that you see on the first slide, in the top left-hand corner is an example of Elahe's 3D render of her 3D model. So she spent years working to research the architecture of torture, the designs associated with torture, systematic torture in the detention center. And she's made now, in consultation, in collaboration, after interviewing many of the people that she was detained with, she's used her skills, her art and architecture skills, to develop a 3D model, and which we'll address a little bit later. And in the bottom right-hand corner is an example of one of her paintings, which is titled 19th of July. And that was the date in 2013 when Kevin Rudd, Australia's former Prime Minister, ruled that anyone coming to Australia without documentation by boat from that date on will never be able to settle in Australia, and really further militarized and securitized the border at that stage. And that was taken over by the succeeding politicians, and still with us at the moment. The other images are examples of my collaborations with Behrouz Bouchani, who was detained for over 6 years in Manus Island and Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea, in particular Manus Island, was for men traveling alone, and Nauru for families, unaccompanied minors, women traveling alone, and yeah, it's, these two sites, I think, are excellent examples of the way Australia's connection with incarceration, or its obsession with imprisonment, going right back to its establishment as a penal colony, is expanding, is morphing, is transforming and replicating itself in different ways. And now, with Australia being the imperial power in the Pacific, Australia's border is now starting to take new shapes and new forms, and becoming part of other sovereign states, impacting other sovereign states. I'll talk a little bit about my collaboration in terms of translating Puchani's work and how that also informs the idea of a shared philosophical activity. Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about public philosophy and how the work that we're doing, the collaborative work that we're doing, is a form of public philosophy. So I've tried to list some modes of public philosophy that are very well known, are practiced quite often. So the first one that I think is for me, I've come across in many cases, and I think is really quite well established, is repurposing theories and arguments for a general non-specialist audience. And this is the philosophers doing this or engaging in this kind of practice. The other one is philosophers producing work targeted specifically at a general non-specialist audience. The third one is philosophers responding to requests, questions, and concerns from a general non-specialist audience. Four, philosophers introducing questions and ideas in order to encourage engagement from a general non-specialist audience. Five, philosophers identifying artistic and cultural productions and questions and concerns in popular culture and public discourse as worthy of philosophical investigation and elaboration. Six, philosophers identifying artistic and cultural productions and questions and concerns in popular culture and public discourse as different forms of doing philosophy. And seven, philosophers commenting, critiquing issues that arise in different public contexts and which were originally discussed and debated amongst general non-specialist audience. So all of these modes center and prioritize the philosopher as the leader, main expert, guide, initiator, and adjudicator. So one example that hasn't been explored and that we think sufficiently and is really pivotal to the work that we've been doing is philosophy produced in collaboration with non-specialist individuals, groups, and audience. So the collaborative work that I've been involved in, in collaboration with displacement exiled peoples, reflects this last model. This is what I've described as a shared philosophical activity. It involves both philosophers and non-specialists working together to identify the philosophical potency of collaborative artistic and cultural work, including the questions and concerns that evolve during the planning and process. It also entails co-creating philosophical work and working together to arrive um, at philosophical discovery by collaborating on scholarship, traditional scholarly and non-traditional scholarly writing, and forms of academic and public engagement, including what we're involved in today. Also, a shared philosophical activity involves people formally trained in philosophy and non-specialists creating new collaborative artistic and cultural productions with philosophical resonance, exploring new collective forms of doing philosophy and introducing new co-devised philosophical questions, concerns, terminology, theories, and critiques, something I'll give some examples for a little bit later. One idea that is really central to our work is the notion of Australia's border industrial complex, which is global, but we look at it in the particular confines of Australia's border regime. So the collaborations that I've been part of with people incarcerated in or recently released from Australia's Castle Border Archipelago, um, which includes Manus Island, Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, the Republic of Nauru, but also Christmas Island and the Australian mainland. So Christmas Island is in Australian territory. And in Indonesia, Australian funded, supported detention centers in Indonesia. Here we have some examples of the text messages that went back and forth between me and Behruz Puchani when he was detained in Manus Island. And the hundreds and hundreds of text messages ended up becoming the multi-award winning book, No Friend But the Mountains. And I I think what's important here is that the rough text messages that I received, also through Manus Island, that was his first translator who compiled the text messages and then put them into PDFs. The, her role was pivotal, but also the role of Sajjad Kabgani, who is also a philosophy researcher. He's in Melbourne at the moment. We worked together involved in a lot of philosophical style seminars, workshops, to really make sure that the translation was on point, really precise in terms of the ideas, in terms of the theories involved, in terms of the history, the messages, the literary dimensions, all of these sorts of things. So the creation of this particular book involved transforming rough text messages into award-winning literature. And what happens in between there is very complicated, and I've discussed that in some of my scholarship. In particular, the translator's note at the beginning of No Friend But the Mountain. Here are some images of my third trip to Manus Island, some images of the detention center, one image of a local Manusian who's the Manusians, their life, their culture, their heritage, their connection to the land has also been severely disrupted by Australia's detention industry. And I think what's important here to mention is that the ecosystem, the environment in Manus has also been damaged. Detention centres are also an environmental hazard, in addition to being a humanitarian atrocity. So these images were from my third trip. On my fourth trip, trying to enter Papua New Guinea, I found out that I was blacklisted. I was deported and obviously denied entry. So this is the way that the border really starts to affect not just the people who are held incarcerated at the border, but all people. All of our citizen rights, all of our freedoms are affected by these particular practices. Another example of shared philosophical activity is the journal Writing Through Fences, Archipelago of Letters. The cover art for this was contributed by Elahe. The painting is titled Concealed Borders. The series of is called Border Industrial Complex. And this particular journal is important because it represents about 100 almost 120 contributors, people who at the time of writing were or recently released from immigration detention in Australia, Christmas Island, including Christmas Island, Papua New Guinea, Nauru, and in Indonesia. And it's work that spans a 9-year period. This is an extremely important work, and it was co-edited by me, Janet Galbraith, Behrouz Bachani, and Hani Abdillah. So when it comes to representing and translating prison narratives, what's really crucial is a particular kind of creative and literary experimentation. So the collaboration involves very specific kind of principles, very specific dimensions that are manifested in the kinds of processes, in the kinds of decisions that are made, in the different examples of the work that we produce, and the foundations of that kind of work, what we draw on. So much of that has to do with experimentation because of the conditions, because of the intense pressure involved. So the shared philosophical activity that I've already mentioned, and a certain kind of anti-colonialism. Like I said, these border regimes are deeply connected with Australia's colonial history and colonial present. And horrific surrealism, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. So some examples of this philosophical ecosystem that's created by these kinds of collaborations. One term that Behrouz introduces is system hakem. He uses this term to refer to the soul of the system, the kind of guiding or driving ideology, but also he refers to it as a kind of agent or a kind of being in uh, in the detention center and right throughout um, uh, the nation state of Australia as well. So here, to translate this term, which I won't have too much time to go into detail about, but I used Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's notion of hierarchy. So her radical feminist theology played a huge role in trying to find the essence, or trying to find the underlying messages, the underlying meanings behind this idea of system hakim. Another term is from Elahe, Aram Saishka, which I have translated as abode for serenity. And so this idea comes from Elahe's final project, architectural project, when she was studying university in Iran, and it's a place of healing, a kind of um, a place designed for dealing with trauma, for creating or contributing to better practices and better ways of living, so for people's well-being. And what's really uh, horrifically surreal in Elahe's case is that she immediately after finishing her studies in Iran and leaving Iran, being forced to flee Iran, she found herself in the complete opposite place, which she'll talk about. I've already mentioned horrific surrealism. Nauru prison theory and Manus prison theory, two philosophical, theoretical frameworks, but also artistic and activist frameworks for engaging with border violence. These have emerged out of our collaborations, out of this shared philosophical activity. And I'll come back to the idea of anti-refugee, pro-refugee disposition, which is influenced by the work of George Yancey, and the border industrial complex, an idea that we've, we've been influenced by people such as Tendai Chiume, who works on digital racial borders, work by people such as Sandro Mezzadra, Brett Nielsen, Jenna Lloyd, various other scholars who have worked on this area, but we've expanded it to think more about the colonial or social imaginary involved, the epistemic dimensions of this, and also the symbolic aesthetic involved. I think this image from the film Choco, Please Tell Us a Time, which I created the subtitles for, but it was a collaborative project co-directed by Behruz Buchani and Arash Kamali Savastani, who was Behruz was in the detention center filming, and Arash was in the Netherlands. They were communicating over WhatsApp to create this particular film. I think this image really, for me, really exemplifies the idea of horrific surrealism. Elahe, I'll leave it there for now, but I'll hand it over to you to discuss some of your upcoming projects, in particular your film, your paintings, and the exhibition.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. This is such an honor to be here. Thank you, Omid, for explaining all of that, including our collaborative project together. So let me start with sharing the render. What do you think, Omid? Should I start sharing the render, explaining about the model, about the film? There are a lot of projects, as you know. So you're muted.
I think it would be fantastic if you could explain the model, show the model, because I think it's just such an excellent and perfect example of the kind of way that you've used your heritage and your expertise to challenge the border industrial complex, and then maybe talk about the connections between that and your other work.
Yeah, of course. Well, okay, so let us start going on a virtual tour into a 3D model that I constructed from the actual detention center that I was detained. If you allow me, I'm gonna share my screen with you and I'll explain more with the video. Here we go. This render is taking us to a photorealistic 3D model of our detention center in 2014. This is very important because, as you see, with the crane and everything, construction was going on all the time since the first time that we got there until the day that I left the island. That is the main part of border industrial complex. A lot of money that was being spent there to torture innocent people, and the money was coming from the Australian taxpayers. Let's get back. As you see, this is the medical tent. The whole detention center was divided to different areas, and we were not allowed to have our medicine. We were being taken with security guards to this tent by a van to take our pills. Depend on the times that we needed to take the pills, we had to go over there. We were not allowed to hold the medicine, and they would supervise us even to swallow the pill. On the right side, as you see, there is a single adult female area, SAF area, where I used to stay. And we were moved again, displaced again inside detention from this area to another part because they were going to construct a prefabricated building for refugee. And all of those districts over there, those areas are family areas. As you see, each area is gated, and we are not allowed to move in an area freely. This is the main gate, Fox 1, where we were being scanned, body scan, body search, before entering the detention center. And yeah, this multi-tent, you saw, I think, in the photo in the slide, the model is actually much cleaner than actual detention center. A lot of facts are not involved yet. This is the shop where we used to go and purchase things with our point. This is the school, the school tent for children. The painting on the wall are actually actual graphic works of the detained teenage, and I've used the photos to replace inside this tent. And behind the tent is actually a very empty corner of the detention center that I can say was the main point where a lot of child abuse and sexual abuse happened. This is the line before the mess where we used to go to eat. And again, this is gated with the security guard. All of these silhouette objects that you see, the shadows are indicating security guards. They are everywhere. So there's always interaction between detainees and security guards. And with the radio, the conversation, the whole atmosphere was representing a war zone, and the same violence as you could see in a war zone. Omid, ask me questions and I can keep going. There's a lot that I can talk about, and I don't want to just confuse you.
No, no, that was fantastic, and it gives us a really strong sense of what the conditions were like, and I think also the horrific and surreal nature of the detention center, the way that it's securitized, the way that it's militarized as well. I think one thing that for me really stands out is the way that you interact with the built environment and the natural environment, and how these two elements feature in not just your paintings, but also your journalism, your analysis, and in particular, the way architecture and design, the way space is weaponized. Maybe you could go into a little bit of detail about these elements, how the architecture, design, and also how your art is a form of resistance.
Well, as you know, I always say that I've been using art and architecture even as a way of practicing resistance, and also as my way of therapy. I'm still learning myself within my work. There are a lot of points that different thing from border industrial complex series of painting and the 3D model and the written pieces and everything with my own experiences from my background in theater or an architecture student. They are all merging. And in terms of the natural environment of detention center, let me add that the whole detention center was built on a former phosphate mine, a toxic environment. So it didn't take me that long to realize that every single element inside that detention center, including the shoes of the site, was meant to torture the detainees. I used to think that it might be just a kind of negligence and just not caring. But as time goes by and I think more, I dig more, I realize that there are more deliberate attempts to create such a prison. You're muted, Omid.
Thank you. Maybe you could explain the title of the painting that's on the screen at the moment, which is part
Oh,
of your
border
border
industrial
industrial complex.
complex. Yeah, let me
The
explain that.
the name of the painting that's on the screen now as well.
I'm not seeing. You should share your screen. When I start sharing the screen, yours is gone.
I'm sorry. Yeah. No. Anthony, is it possible to for me to? Yep. Wonderful. Okay.
Nameless. Nameless is one of the painting that actually was published, I believe, in the Southerly issue that Concealed Border was on the cover. When I started working on the painting inside the detention center, this one was the second one. I believe I started with July 19th. And when I started the painting, it was the main reason was to move on from nightmares. I was dealing with nightmares, repeat seeing nightmares every night. And the painting was my way of dealing with that and my way of therapy. And the title, Border Industrial Complex, was actually offered later by Omid. Thank you so much. I learned a lot because at the beginning, I was just an Iranian woman, artist, journalist who sought asylum from Australia, and I had never heard of border industrial complex or the reality of this kind of prison or xenophobia and hatred in countries, especially in Australia. I had no idea, and I could never believe about the reality of the situation in Australia. But then within my advocacy and after years of working as an activist and artist who uses my art in my advocacy, I believe it was in 2021, Omid, when we talked about my contribution to the Southerly and you offered the title Border Industrial Complex. So this is a great example of shared philosophical activity, the way that we develop our project and we learn from each other. And since then, I've been learning and I'm still learning, especially because this is an ongoing global issue right now. And we're seeing how it's expanding around the world with the UK-Rwanda deal and other European countries. This is horrifying. This is what Omid said, the horrific surrealism that we are seeing in real life.
Thank you, Elahe, and for me as well. Our collaboration has been so enriching and introduced me to so many new horizons and given me so much content to look at and I think the important thing here is that rather than the other modes of public philosophy where the philosopher is the one that is presenting and introducing and organizing and thinking about what to present and how to present it. In this way, the work that I do is impossible without collaboration with you, without the input that you the input that that is so essential to so many different dimensions of our work. I think this issue of shared philosophical activity for me also gives new, I guess, models, new examples, new situations for work in specialist areas of philosophy that deal with collective intentionality, shared agency, and different sorts of areas in epistemology and metaphysics. Actually, that I think the work that we're doing together, I think, has offers a lot of practical, but as well theoretical uh, examples for rich philosophical work, and can lead to really special philosophical discovery. What's the title of the painting that's on the screen now?
Oh, the Nameless? This painting is called Nameless, and it refers to stories on abortion inside detention center. Abortion was legal in Nauru, and Australian government would not allow women to be transferred to Australia to receive the treatment. And horrifying stories around that caused me seeing the nightmares, that in my nightmares I was actually the woman. I've never been pregnant, but I don't know how our traumas work in such a situation, that I was seeing this nightmare over and over, and I was just trying to depict the reality, to depict the stories that are not being told, and I didn't want them to be forgotten. This is a crime against humanity.
Actually, my screen also shows Purple Pain. Is that on your screen at the moment as well? Purple Pain?
Next page, I believe. We are on the old page.
Hmm. Have you got Purple Pain now?
No, not yet.
Strange, mine.
You might stop sharing and share again.
Yeah, maybe.
Let me add also that right now, well, another issue that is important in our collaborative work that is so valuable for me is the women issue. I always say, well, the next painting is going to talk about that purple pain. Oh, very nice timing. Yeah. The purple pain also refers to the resistance and the strength of the women. I can say it started about telling a story of myself and other women whom were detained with me inside the detention center. And also, let me add the injustice that we face in the society as of activists and advocates. I've always mentioned that, and it was a big question for Omid as well, that he mentioned a couple of times that you've been so active and have been working with different medium. I don't know why it took so long for us to have a kind of interaction. I always felt that there have been a will to a kind of hide me or censor me. While I was so active on a lot of social media, Omid had never seen my work. And also picking my work and that contribution in Saudi Arabia, and again, working on the painting in the direction of like the content of the term of the border industrial complex was a great experience. This painting refers to all of those pain. This purple pain refers to that pain, not just within the prison, from inside the prison, not just the gender violence that were coming through the borders, but also the society, the society of activists. Even I can say in some cases, people who are assumed to be feminists, but not.
I'm going to go back to an earlier slide where I talk about the way I used Schussler Fiorenza's notion of hierarchy to translate a term from No Friend But the Mountains. One of the reasons I did that relates directly to the analysis that you've just presented, the critique that you've just presented. So the reason why I chose hierarchy to translate System of Hakem, the term I created was the hierarchical system. Now, the hierarchical system represents intersecting, interlocking forms of violence or systems of violence. So it's for Schussler Fiorenza and her biblical hermeneutics, feminist biblical hermeneutics, she uses this term to go beyond gender, to identify the ways gender or patriarchy is interconnected with or reinforced by other forms of discrimination and domination and subjugation. So race, class, disability, sexuality, militarism, capitalism, and so on and so forth. So many different ways of reinforcing and reinforcing oppression. And I think one thing that's important for hierarchy is the way that it multiplies. It's multiplicable, but it also replicates itself over and over again. And I think this is one of the things in our work is the way that we've identified how Australia's detention industry, one is trans-historical. It goes back to Australia's origins as a penal colony and the dispossession and displacement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The history of Australia and the way that of modern Australia and the way that that incarceration has been used in different ways, especially in indefinite forms of incarceration, and the creation of or the transformation of islands into detention centres or prisons. And I think that that hierarchy is also important because of the way that it's deeply ingrained in a way of thinking. It's deeply ingrained even in language. And I think here it's important to identify the way our collaborations also create new terminology. So border industrial complex is a term that's already used in scholarship, but we've started to give new meaning or new dimensions to it in relation to the work that we're doing, the kinds of critiques that we're engaging in, and also new ideas such as Nauru prison theory, Manus prison theory, anti-refugee, pro-refugee disposition, and of course horrific surrealism. Elahe, if you allow me, before we go to Q&A, I'm going to just maybe finish off the slides very briefly, and then if you have any comments before the Q&A, we can turn to you.
No, please go ahead, and I will just here hanging around. If anyone has question, I'll wait for the questions in the chat. Thank you.
No worries. I think what's also important is the way that this intersectional form of violence is countered by intersectional forms of resistance. So here, one of the ideas or one of the principles that we're committed to is the idea is changing the image of refugees in right across the political spectrum, but particularly in the media and in political discourse. The idea of refugees as weak, needy, broken, somehow also exotic, so as supplicants, as you know, victims, pure victims. And so we're transforming that with new images of refugees as philosophers, as knowledge producers, as creatives, as activists, as leaders. I think what's important also is that this is based on many years of work by Elahe and others, of course. But we're working with a never before seen archive from Nauru, which includes images, videos, interviews, documents, artwork, so much. This is one of Elahe's photographs from the detention center. An example of her 3D model that you've already seen a video of. And the final thing that I'll touch on very briefly is the way that the border and the nation are interconnected. So one of the things that we're really that are really important to us is the tropes that are used to try to explain this, what we call also a neo-colonial experiment. And we think about the border and the nation, the non-citizen and the citizen, in a symmetrical relationship. It's randomly transposable. There's an interchangeable dynamic taking place, and the tropes that we use involve tropes such as synecdoche, where we look at the border and the nation state as a part-whole relationship. But what's interesting here is that the part and the whole can change positions at different points, which an idea that we discuss in our work, but we're planning on furthering in future research that we do together. One of the philosophers, political theorists that I'm influenced by is Chandran Kukatas, whose recent work talks about the way that the border violence is actually, or border control, as he refers to it, is more about controlling the population within the borders. I'll move on from those quotes, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of scholarship we're drawing on, but how we're expanding that as well to create new philosophical examples, new philosophical methods, and new philosophical positions. What I should mention that what Kukatas does is focus on the political economy, on the practical manifestations of these kinds of regimes, these kinds of policies. We're trying to focus a lot more by acknowledging that, but addressing also a lot more the epistemic, the social or colonial imaginary involved, and also the symbolic aesthetic, which relates particularly to the images that are constructed about refugees. Horrific surrealism and reciprocal reinforcement. And again, without going into too much detail, there's a really interesting confluence between collaboration, activism, translation, and storytelling. And all of these represent or reflect disruption, fragmentation, disjointedness, and shattered phenomena. And there's a kind of reciprocal reinforcement between the identities of the people that we're working with, the political landscape, the mode of production, the literary creative dimensions. And I think this makes the work so much more powerful because we have so many of these aspects are not just related to one dimension, but are reinforced, are multiplied and enhance all the other dimensions as well. So without going into too much detail because of time, I think this idea of reciprocal reinforcement and the lens of horrific surrealism, not as a theory, not as a method, but more like a hermeneutical schema, I think is vital here. I'll finish off by mentioning my thought experiment that I introduced in my reflection essay at the end of No Friend But the Mountains, my translation of No Friend But the Mountains. And here I'm influenced heavily by the work of Charles Mills, W.E.B. Du Bois, but also in other areas of interacted with the work of Gail Fallhouse Jr., Christy Dotson, Jose Medina as well has played a huge role in some of the work that I've done on border violence and the kind of creative resistance involved. And one person that I haven't mentioned here is also Elizabeth Barnes. Her work on disability and pride has played an important role in the kind of scholar activist work that I've been involved in, people who were detained or previously detained, recently detained. And I think I'm going to leave it there. And Anthony, if you'd like to maybe conduct the Q&A, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So sorry, I just realized I haven't seen my video screen. I've got to kind of get out the way. There you go. Well, Elahe, I guess you should probably come on screen for it because the questions are going to be directed at both of you. Although actually, funnily enough, it looks like, yeah, one's directed primarily towards Elahe, one towards Omid, and then one seems to be sort of for both of you. So I guess we'll start with the one for Elahe. So this is from Alice, who asks, Elahe, what does shared philosophical activity mean to you? Do you engage with philosophical books or writings, or is it more about a particular style of thinking? Thank you so much.
Thank you for sending the question. Well, I might release some information that I've already written in the article, but it's okay. Well, in terms of reading and engaging with philosophical content, I've mentioned in the article that my first engagement goes back from undergraduate study. As an architecture student, this is a requirement to pass a couple of units in fundamental philosophy, and even the architectural styles that are inspired by different philosophy and different philosophers. But that's also a way of thinking as well, a way of thinking that is changing through the time. We are just traveling around the world, or I don't know, rambling around the world the way that I've been, and it's changing all the time, because my understanding of the world that I'm living in is changing all the time. But what it means to me is the most importantly learning. I say that these kind of shared philosophical activities are very important and impactful in terms of improving and developing our knowledge and our creative works, and in the meantime, the impact of our project, because as an artist who uses her art to advocate for refugees' right, human right, women right, or even environmental issue, all of these concern of our contemporary time. But I think there should be a meaning in any artistic work, especially storytelling. I believe storytelling is very important in all the different kind of creative projects. It can be written articles, book, or artworks. So that means a lot, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Omid, do you have any responses to Elahe's answer or the original question, even though it was directed at Elahe?
No, but I will say that I think for me as well, it's important that even the idea of shared philosophical activity emerged out of the collaborative work. So it wasn't the case that I was thinking about or researching this idea of collaboration and the connections between the collaboration, the activism, co-creation and translation and storytelling. It wasn't that I researched all of these and then I started to engage in it and try to apply it. It was the case that it happened organically while I was engaged in the activism, and so the idea of shared philosophical activity came to me as I saw what was taking place, and what was important for me, and is important for me still, is that there are times when working with different people, and now I see it happening in so many different examples with Elahe, is that while we're collaborating, there are certain ideas that come to me, or certain ways of interpreting, or certain kind of directions that I might suggest that Elahe has already started thinking about, has already started to incorporate in her work, and vice versa. There are things that she'll come to me about and start to suggest and start to change, start to modify, critique sometimes, and I'll think to myself, that's exactly the direction I was going in, or very similar to the direction I was going in. So here that we've got not just the kind of model, or not just a particular understanding or interpretation of collaboration in conjunction with activism, co-creation, translation, storytelling, but we've also got a new way of thinking about identity, a new way of thinking about intentionality, agency, in a more collective way, which I think one offers a lot of examples for rich philosophical work, theoretical work, but also if supported, if really I guess resourced and also if there are more voices involved, can offer a lot of really important possibilities for philosophical discovery moving forward. And of course, public creating new spaces for public philosophy that haven't really been explored fully.
You know, Omid, actually, I was thinking right now that we were discussing that, and you already explained well briefly about Aram Sayeshka, my final project in undergraduate studying at the university in Iran. Well, I can say Aram Sayeshka itself is a kind of offering shared philosophical activity as a way of cue. You know, when we have a combination of philosophy, psychology, spirituality, sport, everything, art together for the healing of the society, and it's a place for public gather together. It needs another long conversation on that, but I think maybe this is an example that we can think about in our like future project.
I think so.
Great. So the next question is directed to you, Omid, and then hopefully once you've given an answer, maybe Elahe can comment on it. So this is from an anonymous attendee who says, I'm interested in the process of Omid's translation of No Friend But the Mountains, in brackets, a book I love. Was this also a form of shared philosophical activity, and if so, how? I think you've sort of touched on some elements of it so far, Omid, but obviously you've been mainly talking about your collaboration with Elahe. So this one's about the collaboration on No Friend But the Mountains.
Thank you for that question. And yes, absolutely. In fact, the idea of shared philosophical activity came to me while I was collaborating with people detained in Manus Island, in particular Behruz Bouchani, and the translation of his journalism and then his book, but also translation of different things as well, as like speeches, tweets, a whole range of different things that were going on at the same time. And I've written about this in my translator's note to No Friend But the Mountains, in different kinds of scholarly work that I've published. What happened was, just to give a very brief overview, because it's extremely complex. I mean, my new book that I'm working on now goes into a lot more detail, and it's impossible to really cover everything. But the text messages for the book went through, majority of them went through Munis Mansoubi, who is part of that shared philosophical activity. And who was his first translator, and also she was my translation consultant. So she got the text messages for the book, most of them, not all of them, but she compiled them into PDFs and sent them to me. When I received the chapters, every single chapter was like one long text message. It was really rough, no editing, everything was one paragraph. So the translation process also involved editing and also involved a lot of research as well. I had to look into a lot of things related to the intellectual, historical, cultural dimensions, the frames of reference. For instance, I knew certain things about Persian literature, Iranian political history, the history of dissidents in Iran. I had to research a lot of when it came to Papua New Guinea and Australia's colonial relationship with Papua New Guinea, and also I had to do a lot more research about Kurdish resistance as well and Kurdish storytelling traditions. So this was part of my translation process. It wouldn't have been the same translation if I hadn't engaged in all of this at the same time. And also I was in daily conversations with Bouchani. I was basically clarifying things, making suggestions, and what's I think to finish off on, there's really too much to say about this, and it's very interesting. But the English translation is extremely different from the Persian original, because all of those conversations, all of that research, all of those modifications were made to the English translation. We had no time, and because we were under so much pressure, we had no opportunities. And Behruz was working off a mobile phone in a detention center with very bad internet, so we had no opportunity to make those changes to the original. So there's in translation theory or translation studies, there's an idea of born translation, the idea that the translation is actually the first text. The text is introduced to the world in translation, and that translation is significantly different from what was written originally. And I think it's significant to mention also that the 20 translations that have been conducted of the book all over the world are from the English translation, which includes the Kurdish translation, which is close in linguistically is closer to Persian, but the translator decided to translate the English version, the English issue, because of what I've just mentioned, all of the work that went into making that, a literary work.
Brilliant. So the final question, which we'll have time for today, is from Elka. So I guess Elahe should probably come back on, as it's not addressed just to Omid. So Elka says, I think that contemporary society has greatly diminished empathy. Can you discuss empathy in the context of your work? So Omid, would you like to start, and then Elahe can follow up, or vice versa, whichever one of you finds the word empathy kind of especially compelling in terms of your work?
Elahe, can I jump in really quickly and just make a quick comment? I've actually mentioned this in some of my earlier work, not just in my reflections on translation, but also in my research on collaborating with people in immigration detention. But I think one thing that is really definite is the idea that sympathy, this kind of operates within this victor-savior dynamic, and is I think reinforces that image of refugees as weak, needy, broken, maybe a little bit quirky, exotic, and so we need something to go beyond just sympathy. But however, I think in this particular situation, empathy might not be the right term to use, the right notion. Is it ever possible, even for me, who's worked so closely with people in immigration detention, and also I should mention my own experiences of displacement and exile and the experiences of my family all over the world, over the last 40 odd years. So I've been engaging with these experiences and these narratives all my life. Empathy is maybe impossible in some circumstances. Not in all, but in some circumstances, but especially when you're dealing with what we call the neo-colonial experiment that is offshore indefinite immigration detention, and onshore as well, I should mention. It's not just the offshore. Is empathy even possible? I think here, this is where the shared philosophical activity can really offer us, I guess, offer us support, offer us ways forward in terms of thinking or imagining better ways of interpretation, and philosophical interpretation in particular. What else do we have other than empathy? Because I think in these cases, it's is that really possible? Elahe?
Well, I think the pandemic was a huge thing to happen in terms of sharing the experience of imprisonment and being in quarantine. Of course, it's not as bad as what people like me have experienced, and of course, not in that scale. But especially in Australia, they had insane rules and policy in controlling people. I even heard that like my family were in quarantine and police would go and check that if they are not leaving the place. And I'm sure, Omid, you've heard a lot of real stories of the quarantine time in Australia. Well, I think it is important, the empathy, and it is appearing more after the pandemic. People have a better imagination, especially for, I can say, in a smaller scale, or zone. Even sometimes I think by myself, it's not based on any fact or evidence or report that I've read. I just imagine that a lot of those white people in Australia who are the voters of Liberal Party. I imagine how they felt when they were in this kind of similar situation, even if it was their own houses, even if it was their own environment. How did it affect their understanding of being imprisoned, not allowed to move, like their freedom being taken away? Well, I have hope. I might be too much optimistic, but I have hope despite all the horrific things and terrible stories and huge losses that we experienced at the pandemic time. I think it has made some kind of changes that we might see more in the future, like of people understanding and the content of imprisonment. That's just a personal thinking.
Yeah. I think, yeah, you're definitely more optimistic than me, and maybe that's something that I need to learn from you. And but I will just mention, it was interesting that you mentioned the pandemic. At one point, Australia was using Christmas Island detention center as a site for quarantine, which again really resonates with that idea of the relationship between the border and the nation.